The cufflinks caught the light as I reached across to shake her father's hand, and I remember thinking how strange it was that a man I'd never met before tonight was about to become family. Her perfume was something expensive and floral, the kind you notice from across a room. She smiled at me the way she smiled in all those magazine features, the ones my son had framed and hung in his apartment like they were diplomas. I smiled back. I wanted to believe. I really did. The rehearsal dinner was at the Chateau Laurier in Ottawa, and my boy had spared no expense. Candles everywhere, a string quartet playing something soft in the corner, waiters in white gloves pouring Niagara Chardonnay into glasses that probably cost more than my first car. My son Owen stood next to her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, and he looked happier than I'd seen him in years. That's what I told myself anyway. My name is Walter Sinclair. I'm 64 years old, born and raised in a small town outside Kingston, Ontario. I built a construction company from nothing starting in 1986, and over nearly 40 years, I turned it into one of the largest commercial contractors in Eastern Canada. We built hospitals, universities, government buildings, good, honest work. My wife Margaret passed 6 years ago from ovarian cancer, and since then it's been just me and Owen, though he's been out in Toronto the last 5 years, working as a junior partner at a financial consulting firm. He's 29, bright, a little too trusting, and the only thing I have left in this world that matters to me. The woman about to become my daughter-in-law was named Celeste Moreau. She was 27, originally from Quebec City, and according to every website and magazine I'd looked up, she was one of the most promising young lifestyle influencers in the country. Over 400,000 followers across her platforms. Brand deals with Holt Renfrew, Aritzia, some Swiss watch company I couldn't pronounce. She spoke 3 languages, had a business degree from McGill, and apparently ran her own boutique marketing agency. On paper, she was remarkable. Owen met her 8 months ago at a charity gala in Toronto. 3 months in, he proposed. 6 months in, they were planning this wedding. Everything had moved fast, but when I questioned the pace, Owen just laughed and said, "Dad, when you know, you know." Margaret and I had only dated for 4 months before I asked her to marry me, so what could I say? The rehearsal dinner was the first time I'd met Celeste's family properly. Her father, Gerard Moreau, was a tall man with a silver beard and the practiced warmth of someone who sold things for a living. He said he was a real estate developer in Montreal. Her mother, Lucienne, was elegant and quiet and spoke mostly in French. And then there was her brother, a man named Philippe, who I disliked almost immediately. Philippe was 34, and he had the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. He shook my hand too hard, held it too long, and called me Walt within 30 seconds of meeting me, though I'd introduced myself as Walter. He wore a suit that didn't quite fit him, the sleeves a touch too long, the collar slightly off, and a watch that was definitely trying to look more expensive than it was. He sat across from me at dinner and spent most of the evening asking me questions. "So, Walt, Owen tells me, you're in construction." "That's right." "Big operation?" "We do all right." "Commercial or residential?" "Commercial, mostly." "Government contracts?" "I bet those are lucrative." I just smiled and sipped my wine. Margaret used to tell me I could be rude when I wanted to be, but the truth is, I just go quiet. I watch, I listen, and I was watching Philippe very carefully. He laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. He glanced too often at my watch, my wedding ring, the cut of my jacket. When the waiter brought the bill for the wine Owen had ordered for the table, Philippe made a great show of reaching for it, then pulled his hand back when Owen waved him off. "Next time," Philippe said, winking at me. There wasn't going to be a next time if I had anything to say about it. Celeste herself was charming. I'll give her that. She asked about my late wife with what seemed like genuine interest. She laughed at my stories. She held Owen's hand under the table and gave him looks that seemed real. But I kept catching little things. The way she and Philippe exchanged glances when certain topics came up. The way her laugh changed slightly when she was talking to me versus when she was talking to my son. Small things. Maybe nothing. I was probably being paranoid. Every father is, isn't he, when his only son is getting married? The first indication that something was genuinely wrong came about an hour into dinner. Owen excused himself to go to the washroom, and while he was gone, Philippe leaned across the table toward me with a conspiratorial smile. Walt, I've been dying to ask you something. I've got this investment opportunity I've been looking at, some development land up in the Muskokas, prime cottage country. I could use someone with your experience to, take a look at it. Maybe partner up. I'm not really looking for new ventures, I said. Oh no, nothing like that. Just a consultation. Maybe a small buy-in, 50,000 or so, just to get in on the ground floor. I'd hate for family to miss out. I set my glass down very carefully. We're not family yet. Something flickered across his face. Just for a second. Then the smile was back. Tomorrow we will be. When Owen came back from the washroom, I studied my son's face. He looked tired, I thought. More tired than a groom-to-be should look the night before his wedding. But then the toast started, and everyone was smiling, and Celeste kissed my son on the cheek, and I told myself I was an old man looking for problems where there weren't any. Then Owen asked me to come out to the terrace for a cigar. We'd started the tradition when he turned 18. A cigar together at big moments. Graduation, his first job, the day he bought his first condo. I figured this was the pre-wedding father-son talk he wanted to have. I grabbed 2 Cubans from my jacket pocket and followed him out into the cold October air. The terrace overlooked the Ottawa River and the lights of Gatineau on the far bank. It was quiet out there, the sound of the dinner muffled behind the glass doors. Owen didn't light his cigar. He just held it, staring down at it in his hand. "Dad," he said, and his voice cracked on the word. "So?" Then he reached out and grabbed my arm, so tight I could feel his nails through my suit jacket. His eyes were red. His jaw was trembling. "Dad, don't let me marry her tomorrow. Please. I'm begging you." I froze. The cigar slipped from my fingers and hit the stone floor. "What did you just say?" "Something's wrong. Something's really wrong. And I don't know what to do. I think she's been lying to me. About everything." I put both my hands on his shoulders and looked him straight in the eye. "Owen, listen to me. Whatever it is, we're going to figure it out together. But you need to tell me everything. Right now." What came out of him in the next 10 minutes changed everything. It had started, he said, about 3 weeks ago. Small things. Celeste had been getting phone calls late at night that she'd take in another room. She'd started being vague about where money was going. They had a joint account now, one she'd insisted on opening for the wedding expenses, and Owen had noticed charges he couldn't account for. A wire transfer to a numbered company in the Bahamas. Cash withdrawals at casinos in Niagara Falls that she'd never mentioned visiting. Hotel charges in Montreal on weekends. She'd said she was doing photo shoots in Toronto. Then, 2 nights ago, he'd woken up at 3 in the morning and found her gone from bed. He'd heard her voice from the guest room, hushed and urgent. He'd listened at the door. She was speaking to Philippe. "It has to be Saturday," she'd said. "After the wedding, before the honeymoon. Once I'm legally his wife, the prenup doesn't matter. I can contest it. My lawyer says 6 months, maybe a year, and we'll have enough to clear everything." Owen had stood in that hallway in his bare feet, and he'd heard his fiancée, the woman he loved, explain to her brother how she was going to bleed him dry. "And the old man?" Philippe had asked. "Did you figure out how much he's really worth?" "More than Owen knows. A lot more. Owen thinks it's a few million. I pulled the corporate filings. The old man is sitting on at least 40 million in assets, maybe more. He just hides it well. Canadian men like him always do." I felt my stomach turn to ice. "Owen," I said slowly, "you're sure? You're absolutely sure of what you heard?" "I recorded part of it, Dad. On my phone. I didn't know what else to do. I've been sick for 2 days. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking maybe I misheard. Maybe I'm crazy. But tonight, seeing Philippe at that table with you, I knew." "Have you told her you know?" "No. I've been pretending everything is fine. I didn't know who to tell. Mom is gone. You're the only person I trust." I pulled my son into a hug right there on that cold terrace, and I felt him shaking against my chest like he was 8 years old again and had just had a bad dream. But this wasn't a dream. This was real. And tomorrow morning, without my intervention, my boy was going to walk down an aisle and sign away his life to a woman, and her brother who had been planning to ruin him from the start. "Listen to me very carefully," I said. "We're not going to do anything tonight. We're going to go back inside, and you're going to smile, and you're going to play your part. Can you do that for me?" He nodded. wiping his face. "Tomorrow morning, before the ceremony, you and I are going to have a meeting at my lawyer's office. I'm going to make some calls tonight. By noon tomorrow, we're going to know exactly who we're dealing with and exactly what we're going to do about it. Do you trust me?" "I trust you, Dad." "Then let's go back in there. And Owen, don't let her see a thing." We walked back into that dinner, and my son put on the best performance of his life. He laughed, he toasted, he held her hand, and I became the old man I'd always pretended to be at these things. Quiet, a little boring, slightly out of it. But inside, I was already working. As soon as I got back to my hotel room that night, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to Arthur Pembroke, my lawyer for 30 years. Arthur lived in Ottawa and owed me more favors than he could count. I told him I needed him in his office at 7 in the morning, draft a new prenup, amend my will, freeze certain accounts. He didn't ask questions. He said yes and told me he'd have coffee ready. The second call was to a man named Daniel Cross, a private investigator I'd used over the years to vet contractors and subcontractors when deals got suspicious. Dan had been RCMP before he went private. I gave him everything I knew about Celeste and Philippe Moreau and told him I needed everything he could find by 9 a.m. He laughed and said he'd been waiting his whole career for a job this urgent. I wired him a retainer that same night. The third call was to my son. He was back at his hotel suite, alone. I told him to get a few hours of sleep if he could. I told him I loved him. I told him tomorrow was going to be all right. Then I sat in my hotel room, looking out at the Parliament buildings lit up in the distance, and I thought about Margaret. She'd always been the one who could read people better than me. She'd met Owen's first serious girlfriend when he was 22 and told me that night, before she'd said 2 words to the girl, that it wasn't going to last. She was right. She'd always been right. I said a small prayer, told her I was sorry I hadn't caught this sooner, and asked her to help me fix it. At 6:45 the next morning, I was sitting across from Arthur Pembroke in his office on Elgin Street. At 7:30, Daniel Cross arrived with a file folder 2 inches thick. What he'd found in one night was staggering. Celeste Moreau was not who she said she was. Her real name was Cécile Morin, and she'd been born in Trois-Rivières, not Quebec City. Her McGill business degree was a lie. She'd taken 2 semesters of night classes and never graduated. The boutique marketing agency existed only on paper. Most of her brand deals were barter arrangements, not paid sponsorships. Her social media following was real, but 40% of it was purchased engagement. More importantly, she had 2 previous engagements. One to a Vancouver tech entrepreneur in 2022, broken off 3 weeks before the wedding when he discovered she was having an affair. That one had settled quietly. The second to a Calgary oil executive in 2024, which had ended in a lawsuit when she'd tried to claim common law status after 4 months together. She'd lost, but only because the man's lawyers were better than hers. Dan had copies of the pleadings. Her pattern was clear. She targeted wealthy men, moved fast, extracted what she could. And Philippe Moreau, or Pierre Morin, as he was actually named, was even worse. He had a criminal record for fraud going back 12 years, 2 convictions in Quebec, 1 in Ontario. He'd done 18 months at Bordeaux for a Ponzi scheme involving Quebec pensioners in 2016. He currently had a civil judgment against him for nearly $300,000 owed to a widow in Sherbrooke. His real estate development business had been dissolved by the province 2 years ago for failing to file taxes. There was more. There were the recordings Owen had made, which I'd had him send me at 5 a.m. Dan had cleaned up the audio. The voices were unmistakable. Celeste, talking about contesting the prenup. Philippe, talking about how much I was worth. A whole conversation about splitting the eventual settlement, with a portion going to pay off Philippe's debts. And then there was the crown jewel. Dan had accessed property records that showed the Moriots didn't own the chateau they'd claimed as their summer home. It was a rental. Their Westmount condo was in foreclosure. The father, Gerard, wasn't a developer at all. He was a mortgage broker whose license had been suspended in 2023. The whole family was a performance. A very expensive, very practiced performance aimed at my son. Arthur pulled out fresh paper, and we got to work. By 10 a.m., we had a new prenup drafted with provisions so airtight that any contestation would be financially ruinous. We'd also drafted a trust agreement that would move my major assets into a structure Celeste could never touch. And we'd prepared a civil fraud complaint that could be filed within the hour. But we weren't going to do any of that. Because I'd realized something, sitting there with that stack of evidence on Arthur's desk. If we just stopped the wedding, the Moreaus would walk away. They'd find another target, another young man in another city. They'd done it before and they'd do it again. Owen and I had to do more than protect him. We had to stop them. The wedding was scheduled for 2 p.m. at a vineyard estate just south of Ottawa. 200 guests, a reception for 400. $80,000 my son had already spent. Money I knew now had partly come from that joint account Celeste had encouraged him to fund. I called Owen at 11. I laid it all out. I told him what Dan had found. I let him sit with it for a long, quiet moment. "Dad," he finally said, "I want to confront her. In front of everyone. I want her family to watch me do it. I want Philippe to sit there and listen to everything. Son, if we do that, it's going to be ugly. Cameras, friends of yours watching. It's going to be the most humiliating day of your life, publicly. It's going to be the most humiliating day of her life, Dad. I'm ready for mine. That's my boy." Margaret would have been proud. At 1:45, I arrived at the vineyard. The weather was perfect. A crisp Ontario fall afternoon, the vines golden and burning red in the October sun. The guests were already seated. The string quartet was playing. Celeste, I was told, was in the bridal suite making final adjustments to her dress. Owen was in a separate room with his best man, a friend from university named Trevor, who had been briefed that morning. I found Gerard Moreau standing by the gift table, with a glass of champagne, looking pleased with himself. I walked up beside him. "Gerard," I said, "might I have a word before the ceremony?" "Of course, Walter. Is everything all right?" "Just a small formality. Come with me, please." I led him to a private room off the main hall, where Arthur Pembroke was already waiting with Daniel Cross and 2 officers from the Ontario Provincial Police I'd arranged the night before. Philippe was brought in a moment later, followed by Lucienne. Celeste was last, wearing her dress, her veil pulled back, confusion giving way to panic as she saw the room. "What is this?" she demanded. Owen came in behind her. He closed the door. "Sit down, Celeste," he said. His voice was calm, steadier than I'd ever heard it. "I'll spare you the details of the next 45 minutes. Arthur laid out the evidence. Dan played the recordings. The OPP officers informed Philippe that he was being taken in for questioning on an outstanding warrant from Quebec that he'd apparently hoped nobody would check. Gerard Moreau sat through the whole thing with his face draining of color as his lies came out one by one. Lucienne started crying. Celeste, to her credit, didn't cry. She got angry. She accused us of entrapment. She threatened to sue. She called Owen names. I won't repeat. Owen let her finish. Then he took off his engagement ring, the matching band he'd been going to give her, and set it on the table in front of her. "I loved you," he said. "I really did. And you saw that as weakness. I'm sorry for you, but I'm done." I walked out with my son, and we announced to the 200 guests in that vineyard that the wedding was canceled. Some people gasped. Some people wept. Some people, I noticed, didn't look all that surprised. Owen stood up on that little platform where he was supposed to get married and thanked everyone for coming, apologized for the circumstances, and invited them all to enjoy the reception food anyway because he'd paid for it, and damned if it was going to go to waste. That's my boy. Philippe was arrested that afternoon. The charges in Quebec turned out to be more serious than we'd thought. Another fraud investigation involving senior citizens. Celeste fled back to her mother's apartment in Trois-Rivières, and we heard nothing from her until 3 weeks later, when she tried to file a civil suit claiming emotional damages. Arthur had her served with our counter-complaint within an hour. She withdrew within a week. Owen moved back to Kingston for a while after the wedding. He needed his father. We spent that first winter together, ice fishing on the lake he'd grown up skating on, long, quiet dinners at the house where he'd been raised. We talked about his mother. We talked about love, and how hard it is to know when it's real. We talked about trust. He asked me one night, sitting by the fire with a glass of 40 Creek between us, how I'd been so sure, how I'd known what to do. "I didn't know, son," I told him. I was just afraid. I've been afraid for you your whole life. That's what being a father is. You don't always know. You just pay attention. And when someone you love tells you something is wrong, you believe them, and you act. It's been almost a year now. Owen is back in Toronto. He's dating someone new, a woman named Jane, who works as a pediatric nurse at Sick Kids. She's kind and she's ordinary, and she looks at him the way his mother used to look at me, like he's the only person in the room. He's not rushing anything this time. He's taking it slow. I met Jane at Thanksgiving. We talked about her family in Thunder Bay and her work with the kids. She didn't ask me a single question about my business. Not one. I liked her immediately. I think sometimes about that night on the terrace when my son grabbed my arm and asked me to save him. I think about how close we came. How many men in my position would have told their son to calm down, not to ruin a beautiful wedding over cold feet. I think about how much I nearly lost. And I think about the lesson I pass on now to any father who'll listen. Don't teach your sons to be strong. Strength they'll figure out on their own. Teach them to pay attention. Teach them that the quiet voice in the back of their head, the one that says something isn't right, that voice is worth more than all the money in the world. Because money you can always make back. A life spent tied to the wrong person, you only get the one. That's the victory I'll take. A son who listened to that voice in time, and a father who was still there to hear him when he called.